current state of affairs in the country today. So Malaysia has truly taken a hit from the pandemic on so many levels. Household losing income, being forced to raise white flags for food, students are falling back in school, not to mention the general toll it has taken on people's mental health. Saddiq and Michelle, I know you have done so much meaningful work on the ground to aid your constituents while maintaining their dignity and giving them a sense of hope in these trying times. There is a sense of outrage from the rakyat towards the government as a result of how this pandemic has been handled. A recent example is the Menteri Besar of Kedah, Sanusi Noor, announcing that raising the white flag for help is an anti-government propaganda when really the white flag is a cry for help. Even today with the Raise the Black Flag movement, it is evident that the rakyat has had enough. To what extent can the chaos in governance today be traced back to the Sheraton move and party hopping? YB Saddiq, if we could start with you.
I think a lot of it could be traced back. I think one of the greatest problems of the ability of the government to manage COVID well and to ensure that we have a proper functioning economy is stability. And Sheraton shattered that. It ensured that there's great uncertainty politically and economically. It also ensured and locked in a belief where your political allies could backstab you at any point in time. And I believe that's exactly what Bersatu is facing today. A revolt within UMNO to challenge and confront Bersatu leadership. And we've seen that not only among some of the political elites like Zahid Najib, but we're looking at even on the branch and Cawangan level. And when there is great uncertainty, politics and economically, it becomes much, much harder for the government to deal with COVID well. It becomes much, much harder for the government to roll out a financial package well. That's where you see a lot of politics of patronage taking place, buying over MPs by cash, money positions through GLCs, which then lead to great mismanagement of GLCs. And we've witnessed it in Prasarana and many other GLCs where in the end, it's merely a way to buttresses government's slim majority, but at the same time destroying the integrity of GLCs and our ability to run a proper functioning economy. So if you ask me, I think Sheraton was the beginning of the failure of Malaysian democracy. And moving forward, I think it's more interesting to talk about the solutions. I believe prior to next election, before we even enter election mode, all parties should commit and the government should commit, including if UMNO is still part of government. I don't think they will be part of government before GE. We should ensure that the anti-hopping law is implemented or a recall election system is done. I believe there's great political appetite for that. And for us to ensure that democracy wins post-election, which is in the interest of all political parties, I think that should be sealed prior to election.
Thank you, YB Saddiq. YB Michelle, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I definitely concur with what YB Saddiq has seen. In fact, you see the cracks materialize in the way the SOPs are drafted and the way they keep changing literally daily. It's as if within the ministry, you have daily lobbying either from the outside to relevant ministries and within the cabinet as well, thus resulting in lots of instability that I think the rakyat after 3 MCOs can discern for themselves what is going on politically inside. And it's unfortunate because what you see are lives literally being affected. Tan Sri DG Noor Hisham has just announced a number of brought-in date cases being at startling numbers. And I wonder to what extent that could be mitigated just by having some sort of clarity and stability, as what YB Saddiq has actually said. I am in support of some sort of regulation to determine what can or cannot be done by political parties, by members of parliament, or even ADUNs. In fact, I took part in a debate in the State Assembly in that regard, supporting some sort of legislation. So I definitely concur that something needs to be done, at least something like what is being done in Penang, where in a way they foresaw the possibility of this happening, and earlier on, before it actually materializing, they have put in legislation by way of their state constitution to try to deal with that. Of course, that is being tested now, but that shows some level of commitment, and I think that is important now more than ever. But what I think is important in the context of today's topic is how young people and lay people need to really play a part in policy making and also in democracy, because more than ever, for so many years, I think many of us have not really felt the effects of political instability. And it's unfortunate that it took a pandemic for us to realize how policy making really affects our daily lives. And I hope that in some ways, this is a wake-up call for many of us. And I hope that energizes each and every one of us to do our part.
Thank you, YB Michelle. Tharma and Kira, I know that Undi 18 works very closely with the Rakyat on the ground, you know, and what has your experience been in this season when you speak to people? What is the general sentiment, and how has, you know, party hopping and the Sheraton move affected how people feel towards governance and, you know, how much autonomy the Rakyat has? Can we start with Kira, perhaps?
Yes. Yeah, sorry. Yes, I think the Sheraton move has, besides destabilizing government, it has shown that, you know, to many young people that they begin to question the value of their vote, you know. And I think when it comes to, for many young people, you know, I was a first-time voter myself in 2018. And then, you know, when you see all this different politicking happen, it does, you know, cast a shadow of doubt in your mind whether, you know, the effort that you took to vote, effort you took to mail your ballots, or that whether it was of value or not. And I think already in Malaysia, you know, even before Undi 18 and automatic voter registration was passed in Parliament, we already have a society that doesn't cultivate a behavior towards voting. In a way, we don't make sure that access to register to vote is something that is very easy for everyone. You can only do it online or post office, right? In other countries, you see you can register to vote at the DMV or our version of a JPJ. You can register in, like, you know, any government building basically. So I think when you want to include you know, the voices of young people in formal politics, you know, it's also important to look at what role young people can play in voting when they participate in a democracy. So many studies have shown that, you know, many citizens are not willing to get rid of representative democracy, right? I think the system we have now is something that, you know, it will be very challenging to reform it overall as a whole, right? So a great number of them, however, you know, even though they're not willing to reform our democracy, they do not trust their representatives, and they want representation to be improved, especially for young people. And I think the idea of a recall election, this concept, gives them the power to regain control. I think when Sheraton move happened, of course, you know, beyond a lot of the PH politicians that were ousted and, you know, had to be moved around, young people lost the power. They lost the power to speak up. They lost the power to make a point. They feel that, you know, we always tell people that, oh, voting is the easiest way to participate in a democracy, and then you take that power away. So I think when you introduce the mechanism of control, like a recall election, the possibility to remove elected representatives from office through a vote before the end of the term, I think this basic principle will support political participation of young people a lot more, and it can extend even across the electoral cycle, which in Malaysia typically would be once every 5 years. And then, you know, coupling that with, of course, many other interventions would I think foster a more robust youth participation in our democracy, starting with voting in elections.
Dharma, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think very much echo what Kira says in terms of there is that feeling of a loss of trust towards the system, feeling that, okay, you know, there's this whole thing where we voted for change, right? Because when you look at data, young Malaysians overwhelmingly voted for change, whether it was in favor of PAS or whether in favor of PH in various states. And this was based on the data from last elections, right? So you could see that there was a huge shift because there was a desire to see, okay, what is that alternative government? And then you can see the same bunch of people come back into power, right? Still hold the cards, and none of the promises, none of the reforms, or very few of the reforms managed to become reality. So I think there is that sense of anger and distrust. But I do think that this is part of the process of political maturity, of achieving that in our country, right? Because if we think about it, Malaysia is an extremely young democracy. While we've been a democracy for 60+ years, but when you are a one-party state, right, there isn't much democratization going on, right? People don't regard themselves as agents of change. They don't regard themselves as potential voters, and they don't consider how does political party choice affect their lives, immediately. So I think that process sort of has transformed what's happened over the past few years has sort of changed how people see politics, and I hope it does result in a more mature electorate, right? And I think one element of a mature electorate, in my opinion, is distrust, right? I fundamentally believe that a healthy electorate should distrust their leaders, right? Because yes, you give them power. Yes, we vote them to be our leaders, but you should not just let go of power and say that, okay, you know what, I'm done. My role and responsibility is done, and therefore these leaders I've chosen will just make Malaysia great or something like that, right? So I think that sense of distrust is something that is something that I hope more people will have in terms of building that more mature democratic process. But I do think that there is that danger that this distrust becomes apathy and cynicism, right? I think that is the danger that we have. So which is why processes, I think, one of giving this sort of mechanisms to make sure that their vote has meanings and their democratic choice has some sort of strength. I think that part is very important. That's number one. Number two is to ensure that that when we talk about the voting or the democratic process itself, I think it's so important for us to consider about not only the democratic process change also, but to see, using the experience of the pandemic, how it has affected all of us. And we cannot ignore politics fundamentally. So no matter how cynical you are about politics, the reality is that, I think with this pandemic, we absolutely realize that, you can't ignore it. So therefore, it's so important. If you want to continue living in Malaysia, you want to build a better country, you cannot ignore it. You must choose a better leader. So it's time for you to push for policies that help you get better and better leaders over time. I think that's the fundamental idea.
Thank you, Tharma. That I absolutely agree with that. Saudara Ashraf, would you like to add to that?
Terima kasih Debbie dan rakan-rakan panelis yang lain. Saya ingin sambung sedikitlah apa yang Tharma cakap tadi. Saya setuju dengan, saya rasa kita ada idea lah bahawa sebenarnya lepas Sheraton seolah-olah kuasa rakyat ataupun rakyat sebagai tuan ataupun sebagai bos dalam demokrasi dirampas. Sebelum ni, walaupun macam Tharma cakap, kita dalam demokrasi Malaysia ni dah lebih 60 tahun. Dan kita, rakyat Malaysia diajar bahawa pilihan raya adalah medan terbesar untuk memilih parti dan adalah medan terbesar demokrasi untuk mesahkan siapa yang akan memimpin Malaysia. Dan rakyat telah memilih pada 2018 untuk memilih satu kerajaan alternatif yang barulah, yang kerajaan baru. Tapi benda itu telah dirampas dan seolah-olah undi kita dah tak berguna. Undi rakyat dah macam tak berguna, dah diketepikan. Walaupun rakyat memilih atas satu bendera yang lain, tapi tiba-tiba ada sekelompok yang keluar, dan Sheraton Move itu memang memberi impak yang besar. Sebab tidak pernah dalam sejarah kita lepas kerajaan digulingkan begitu, dijatuhkan begitu, kemudian disusuli dengan beberapa kerajaan negeri lagi. Kalau ikut rekod daripada 2018 selepas itu 2020 selepas Sheraton Move, dah 7 kali kita ada perubahan kerajaan persekutuan. Perak 2 kali, Johor, Melaka, Sabah lah sekali lah. So ini menyebabkan rakyat mungkin disilusi lah, keliru kan, apa yang perlu dibuat. So saya rasa memang perlu ada satu undang-undang lah, satu mekanisme untuk mengembalikan kepercayaan rakyat bahawa kita setuju dengan Tharma bahawa rakyat jangan perasaan distrust itu menjadi sesuatu yang lain kan. Jadi dia tak mahu mengundi dan sebagainya, tapi kita perlu ada sistem untuk memastikan benda itu boleh disalurkan. Iaitu antaranya adalah yang macam bersih advokasikan sekarang adalah dah ada pecah wakil rakyat ataupun recall election lah. Kita cadangkan untuk ada mekanisme ini untuk memecah wakil rakyat yang di atas beberapa kriteria. Mungkin lepas ni saya boleh bincang lebih lanjut, tapi mekanisme itu perlu supaya rakyat merasakan bahawa mereka sebenarnya penting dalam demokrasi ini. Sebab kita lihat wakil-wakil rakyat yang melompat ni, dia tak ambil peduli tentang apakah sentimen rakyat. Walaupun ialah alasan-alasannya, contohnya alasan yang sebelum ini disebut oleh satu ADUN di Perak bahawa dia melompat ke menyokong kerajaan yang baru ni adalah disebabkan supaya pertukan beliau terus disalurkan, dan CDF lah, Constitution Development Fund, ataupun pertukan pembangunan kawasan itu terus disalurkan kepada kawasan beliau. So isu-isu begini saya rasa menjadi alasan besar lah, tapi sebenarnya saya tak rasa itu alasan utama lah. Tapi itulah, benda tu dah jadi, dia tak peduli pun siapa yang mengundi dia dulu. Dia hanya lompat berdasarkan apa yang dia rasa betul. Tapi tanpa menghiraukan, sebab apa saja keputusan kerajaan, apa saja keputusan wakil rakyat, yang paling terkesan adalah rakyat, terutamanya yang B40. Mereka ni mungkin dari sudut politik lebih tidak cakna berbanding yang middle class ataupun yang T20. Tapi mereka lah yang paling terkesan akibat isu-isu kerajaan tak stabil, kerajaan tak dapat keputusan yang tepat sebab memikirkan keputusan itu perlu strategik untuk politik sendiri ataupun strategik untuk rakyat. Dia takut hilang kesokan dan sebagainya lah. So saya rasa itu perlu ditangani dengan segera supaya kita tidak dapat melihat gelombang penentangan terhadap sistem itu sendiri dan menyebabkan sistem demokrasi di Malaysia ini dirobohlah bila rakyat dah tak mau terlibat dalam pilihan raya.
Terima kasih, Saudara Ashraf. All of our panelists have mentioned, distrust, how we shouldn't let the distrust fester into anger and things like that. It all started from GE, and if we remember the sentiment, the collective sentiment of the country during general election, it was so different from where we are now, full of hope, full of, we can do this together, we as Malaysians can pull together and make this happen. And I think that there was so much of trust there. And then the Sheraton move happened without consulting the rakyat. And then party hopping, I think we've got about 60 cases of party hopping in the past year and a half, which leads to distrust and anger. And this then leads to hopelessness. So often now the rakyat wonder, like, why should I go out and vote when my vote doesn't matter? So that's one part of it. The second part is in party hopping. I'd like to point out that not all cases of party hopping are unethical or bad. It's not that every single politician who party hops, has betrayed the mandate of the people. There are politicians who party hop or are maybe sacked by their parties because they are ethical, for example. I think at the end of the day, how do we convince voters that power is still in their hands, whether they want to sack their elected representatives or keep them? So my question right now would be, why should voters continue to exercise their voting rights? Why shouldn't they give up right now? And the second question is, in this climate where the general sentiment is disappointment and anger and distrust, what can voters do to take power back into their hands? Because if you are to say to someone, voters, don't give up, you're a voter, you're a Malaysian, you have a right to exercise your voice, go ahead and exercise your voice. That the question is this: how do I, as a layperson, at this point in time, what can I do to change things? How does my vote now matter? Do I have to wait for the next 5 years? So the question is, how do we get voters to continue exercising their voting rights despite, party hopping? And what can they actually do? Can we start with YB Michelle, please?
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. I really like that question. And I identify with how many voters out there feel. My first vote, when I cast it was in London while I was still studying. And I was really rooting for a change then, which obviously didn't happen. And when it didn't happen, I just sensed a wave of hopelessness that came over me. And I wondered that exact same question: what can I, as a young person, and more so being so far away, do something about what is happening so far back home? When I speak to young people, I like to do an exercise with them, and it goes something like this. I would get them to take a little bit of time to list 5 issues that they are not happy with in Malaysia. And once they're done, they just have to say done. More often than not, between when the exercise starts and when they come out with that 5 points, it takes them a very, very short time, which tells you that, yeah, a lot of people know what they're not happy with. Now we move on to solutions. So the next part of the exercise is to get them to come up with 5 solutions to those 5 issues that they have raised, and they do have answers to those, which is very heartening because, you know, people do think about it. And these solutions don't have to be what you have to do, but just solutions in general. And then the third part of the exercise is just for them to think about one way in their current capacity that they can do something about the issues that they have raised. So the time taken to answer each part of the question tends to get longer and longer, right? And the point that I like to drive home is this: look, it's very easy to look for problems. It's more difficult to find solutions, and sometimes it is more difficult to find our place in that picture. But when we ask each person what their answer was to that third part of the question, all of them have an answer. And that tells me that it is possible for you to find that space. Now, sometimes it feels very far away from us. I don't think you need to set up a society and join civil society necessarily for you to do your part. I do think that within your current capacity, there is a lot of opportunity. So I'll give you an example. When I came back to Malaysia as a lawyer, I was just second, third year lawyer, and I didn't think that I could do very much then. But little did I know that right at about that time was when redelineation was going to happen. And there were not many lawyers out there who were willing to spend after work hours to pursue those cases. There were, but there were not many. And then you had beyond redelineation cases, those quiet delineation cases where they didn't go through the process in Parliament, but it happened quietly and administratively. So not very sexy cases, you won't get the limelight, but equally problematic because it's the same thing, whether you go through redelineation to shift 5,000 voters or you shift them administratively, not according to constituency lines. So I found myself in that space, driving up and down Kuala Kubu Baru in the middle of the night, and also Segamat in the middle of the night, coming back at 3 o'clock and then going to court the next day. And I felt that that was necessary and there was a lot of fulfillment in that. Just to let you know, those 2 cases, one of it was resolved after we came into power. So administratively, those cases were realigned. And the other case, we were able to engage with the EC to try to resolve it as well. And that's heartening because if you look hard enough, you will be able to find that space. And you don't have to be a lawyer. So if you're a data analyst, what can you do? There is so much out there that you can do. In order to get that data out to show the court that, hey, look, this is happening. I, as a lawyer, could only do that much. There's a reason why I read law and not math or statistics. And so we had to work with data analysts. We had to work with consultants who were willing to spare that kind of time and effort. And of course, having their hearts aligned to that cause. So there is that space. And I believe that if you do look hard enough, you will definitely be able to find it.
Thank you so much, YB Michelle. That was so encouraging. YB Saddiq, what are your thoughts on this?
I understand the general feeling of hopelessness. And to be honest, it's good that we feel a sense of hopelessness and anger because that shows that we care. The last thing which I want is for people to just feel so ambivalent as if nothing is going on. Because apathy is far, far worse than a sense of anger and hopelessness. On this path, I think I'd like to suggest to channel the level of passion and enthusiasm towards changing systems instead of personalities only. So that's why I always stress on the need prior to election to ensure that our system is in place. And the good thing post GE14 is that every politician, minister, party now is more cognizant of public sentiment. That if they can no longer choose to merely ignore sideline voices of the people, because if they do, then they will be outvoted. This is no longer the time where a government can hold on to power indefinitely. And I believe last election has showed that you can spend billions of ringgit, you can co-opt democratic structures and systems, but yet the wave will come and the wave will topple you. And when politicians, those in government and opposition, are a lot more sensitive to public sentiment, I think the demands of the public must be a lot more specific as well. which is to demand for systems change, to demand for parties to state their stance on Political Funding Act, on anti-hopping laws, on many institutional reforms, which I believe will set our system right. And post-election, whoever forms government will no longer be able to create a system where winner takes all. My final message is this on this point. I believe those who constructed the Sheraton move, those who devised it, want you to remain hopeless, want you to feel a sense of apathy, want you to opt out from the democratic system. Because in the end, the ones who will win the most are them. These are the people who will continue to cling on to power. These are the people who will continue to buy votes. These are the people who will continue to ensure that our nation will be on a continuous decline to hell. And if we want to challenge and confront these individuals, we must come together, and change is never easy. And it will and more often than not, it will take time. However, if we come together and we are able to beat the sense of apathy and hopelessness, I believe that's where structural reforms and change can take place. And those who no longer serve your interests, no longer stand for the reforms which you want, you vote them out, you tell them that in the end, you are the bosses, and us politicians are merely vehicles to your aspiration. Do not lose hope, because in the end, hope is in your hands, and you are the ones who will define what politics is about. If we stay away from politics and from the systems of democracy, then the very people who we dislike, hate, who we know are taking our country to a very dangerous path will be the ones who will determine not just our future, but our children and grandchildren's future. I believe that's very scary to even think of.
Thank you so much, Saddiq. I really like what you said. Do not lose hope, because hope is in your hands, and it is the voters who then define what the political landscape of Malaysia should be like. Kira, I'd like to ask you what your thoughts are on what young people can do to take action and, you know, exercise their vote and their voices.
I think one easy way, first of all, is to join Undi 18's programs. I think we try to design as many inclusive and diverse programs as possible on various policy platforms. So I think it's a work in progress, and I think the goal is always, I think coming from an organizer and someone with a bit of an education background, is that I'm always thinking that, you know, when it comes to political education, what does it really mean for young Malaysians? What is it, just teaching them like the ideologies? Is it just teaching them history of Malaysia and history of political parties, or is it actually allowing them to feel situations and or events that would be, you know, that would force them to make a decision? So a lot of the program that Undi 18 does is very simulation-like. It's very experiential, you know, from Parlimen Digital to today we launched Muda Malaysia to ADUN Selangor. You know, these are all very experiential programs, because if you don't force young people to be in that position where they have to make a choice, where they have to argue on behalf of others, where they have to, you know, actually do research when they complain about something, you know, I think like YB Bisha pointed out, the activity is very, very good, because then I would love to follow up with that, you know, what research do you know? What information do you have to make that sort of like judgment or assumption about Malaysia or your community or even about the government? So I think, you know, when it comes to a topic of like even party hopping and things like that, first of all, I think everyone is very angry that, you know, many people party hop during Sheraton move. But fundamentally, we also need to educate them that party hopping is unfortunately a constitutional right for them. It is not illegal for them to party hop. So if we can't forbid them, what are the mechanisms, what are the institutional reforms that need to be in place to restore balance? You know, this is why institutions and democratic institutions are so important. You know, there is a reason why everything can be somewhat back to normal except Parliament. You know, there is a reason why you know, the one institution that is supposed to ensure check and balance is not accessible to the public, is not even accessible to the opposition right now. So I think what young people can do is taking the time to educate ourselves and to understand what are the systemic issues and systemic structures that exist to either reduce access or to disempower you, you know, from being a more educated citizen, or from being a more vocal citizen, and from being a community leader, you know. And I think because when it comes to, I think when we understand and are able to untangle all these complexities, we can find our agency and we can find our voice. And I think a lot of young people, in my experience of running our programs, the one main thing that always stops them is confidence, right? So every time we organize programs and sessions, we always try to expose them to other young leaders so that we can show them that if other people can do it, they can do it as well. So there are there are generally two main things that sort of like disempowers young people. You have systemic structures and also the intrinsic values, also to say, right, that hinders them. So, but right now, if you look at like what are some institutional measures that we can take to restore power, to restore balance, to allow agencies, I think one example of this is a recall election, and one example of this is allowing people to sack their MPs for going back against their promises prior to elections.
Thank you so much, Kira. And I really, agree with you on what you said about simulations, because simulations are so important. What Undi 18 is doing, you can't know how something actually works until you actually do it. Look at what can be improved. Look at how to change things. Simulations are so important. And thank you so much for sharing with us how young people, together with YB Michelle, who also shared how young people who are, soon to be voters or young voters can continue to drive the future of Malaysia forward. Dharma, I'd like to ask you about the more seasoned voters. We cannot discount seasoned voters because they are truly the foundation of our Malaysia. And this group can be susceptible to hopelessness with how things are being run right now. And who can blame them? I have a grandmother who's 96 years old. I remember, a couple of years ago, she went to vote. It's not easy for them to go and vote. It's actually, a whole production. They have to get someone to get them, things like that. And when these things happen, when the pandemic happens, when they don't feel that the government is upholding, their well-being and their right as a citizen, it gets really hard to not be, upset about it or be in despair. What do you think more seasoned voters can do to change things?
Honestly, I mean, let's be very honest, right? We live in a very gerontocratic society, right? Which means that most institutions, most power bases are fundamentally held by those who are seasoned or senior voters, right? When you talk about government, it's always controlled by senior voters. NGOs, corporations, even if you look at our voting percentage, young voters tend to be in urban areas, right? Whereas older citizens tend to be in rural seats where their vote is about 3 to even 10 times more powerful than those in urban seats. So if you ask me a question of what can they do, I feel like it's sort of an odd question in my mind, because the reality is that a lot of seasoned voters hold a lot of institutional powers, right? Maybe not themselves directly, but people that they know, right? People who are in their circles, right? People who are just maybe 2 or 3 degrees of separation from them. So I think that is I don't necessarily think it's a big issue in terms of giving them power, because the structures of a society already give them power. The question is, do they want to exercise that power? Do they understand the issues that's going on, right? And I think this is one of the things that I've noticed, that also talking about differences in generation, right? I personally believe that from what I see is that what young people also must do is to try to change a lot of the cultural norms that the older generation or the more seasoned voters have sort of adopted. So what are these sort of cultural norms? The focus on race and religion, right? So which means that there is, if you look at any data or any polls, it will show that older voters tend to be more willing or more attracted to only voting for people who are in the same race or religion as them. That's one. Number two is that there is this sense of feudalism, right? Where they do not want to be seen as kurang ajar or do not want to be seen as biadab to certain leaders, no matter how disappointing this leader is. So there's a sense where you have to control yourself, right? I think that's number two. Number three, I think there's also this idea or this concept where you have to choose the right leaders, right? That means there's this focus on individual leadership and how that will transform the country. But when you ask younger leaders, you ask YB Saddiq, you ask YB Michelle, they will tell you that often it's not the leaders, it is the structure and the system, right? And leaders are molded by the system and structure. I think this is the challenge that we need to go and talk to, right? So for me, I think it's very difficult for me to answer the question of what can they do, because the reality is that they can do a lot if they wanted to. The real question is, how do we convince them that they have to act, or they have to change their mindset, something that they're used to for the past 30, 40, 50, 60 years, right? And they've normalized as part of their life. This is their entire worldview, right? How do you convince them to change? I think that's the bigger challenge. I think to some extent, I think young people managed to do some sort of change during the last elections. You know, when people went back homes and they became agents of change in their family. They spoke to their moms, they spoke to their grandparents and said that, okay, you know what, maybe let's go for change this time. Let's try things out. So for me, I do think that, you know, when we have this sort of conversations, I do fundamentally think that young people, as those who have the most or the easiest access to information, we have the easiest or the ability to understand these sort of concepts better, and we have the ability, or our worldview is still malleable, right? Which means that we are not set in stone yet for many of us, right? Maybe not all of us, but many of us. So I think we are, as young people, we can be agents of change. And I think it's so important to have these sort of conversations with our older voters, make them realize that, hey, you have that authority and power. It's time for you to make those choices that that is away from those cultural norms. And of course, honestly, it's easier said than done, right? Which is why for us with Undi 18, we like to invest in young people just because mindsets and worldview is still malleable, and therefore you can invest in the future. But talking about seasoned voters, honestly, I wish it was easy to just sort of just flip things and they'll be like, yeah, systemic change, no, and stuff like that. But yeah, it is what it is now.
Thank you so much, Dharma. Ashraf, Bersih works very, the work that Bersih does is voter-centric. Bersih tries its best to empower voters. What are your thoughts on this?
Ya, mungkin ya memang sebab Bersih, memang kita adalah advokasi untuk memperkasakan rakyat. So memang kebanyakan aktiviti kita cuba melibatkan dan cuba mendidiklah rakyat seramai mungkin berkenaan proses-proses, dan memang itu bukan satu benda yang mudah. Saya rasa mungkin Bersih dah 15 tahun semenjak ditubuhkan 2006. So dah lama proses itu berjalan untuk kita mendedahkan, mencerahkan rakyat berkenaan proses-proses demokrasi, institusi-institusi demokrasi yang dalam negara, dan institusi tersebut perlu berjalan dengan ataupun perlu diduduki dan berjalan dengan baik, dengan mementingkan kepentingan rakyat terbanyak. So contohnya macam sebab itu bila kita sebut tentang kuasa rakyat, betul-betul kita nak memperkasakan rakyat, memberikan semula kuasa itu kepada mereka. Sebagai contoh yang macam cadangan Bersih sekarang ini untuk recall election. Sebab memandangkan kita lihat kebanyakan lompat-melompat dan sebagainya, menyebabkan kerajaan jatuh dan sebagainya. Jadi kita cadangkan satu mekanisme untuk memecat wakil rakyat yang melompat, ataupun ada beberapa perkara lain yang kita senaraikan. So ini memberikan semula kepercayaan rakyat bahawa mereka ini mempunyai kuasa, betul-betul mempunyai kuasa untuk menentukan siapa yang akan mewakili mereka, polisi apa yang akan wakil rakyat itu bawa. Sekiranya mereka tak setuju, mereka boleh pecat lah, kan? Jadi sebab itu juga kita buat simulasi recall election di Teberau ni, kita nak test lah. Sebab kita tahu rakyat marah dengan lompat-lompat parti, tapi rakyat tidak ada cara lah untuk meluahkan perasaan, untuk menyatakan kemarahan, melainkan sekadar di media sosial. Dan ini bagus sebenarnya. Dan tapi kita juga perlukan satu push lagi untuk wakil-wakil rakyat ataupun ahli-ahli politik untuk memikirkan apa jalan ke depan supaya negara ini lebih stabil di masa hadapan. Jadi mekanisme seperti yang tercadangkan recall election ataupun apa-apa undang-undang yang berkaitan. Kemudian kita cadangkan juga bahawa perlu ada polisi yang lebih baik. Sebagai contoh CDF yang lebih equal lah, atau pertukaran pembangunan kepada semua wakil rakyat oleh kerajaan negeri ataupun kerajaan persekutuan yang lebih adil, supaya supaya tidak ada lagi lah insentif kepada wakil rakyat yang melompat ini dan menyebabkan kurang insentif untuk wakil rakyat melompat dan sebagainya. Jadi itulah, so pendidikan itu memang sangat penting lah. Saya rasa undi 18 yang banyak yang touch dengan pengundi muda. Mungkin bersih sekarang ni lebih dikenali oleh pengundi yang tak berapa muda lah. Tapi kita cuba juga untuk untuk mendekati anak-anak muda, sebab saya rasa ini pandangan peribadi lah, bukan pandangan presiden, bahawa sebenarnya paling terkesan voter education itu adalah, atau pendidikan pengundi adalah apabila rakyat itu sendiri berani untuk turun ke jalan ataupun untuk turun menuntut apa yang mereka nak secara organik. Itu saya rasa itu paling berkesan untuk rakyat, untuk yang menunjukkan bahawa rakyat betul-betul cakna tak apa yang berlaku. Tak semestinya di peringkat yang lebih besar kan, macam peringkat negara atau isu-isu besar negara. Dia cukup sekadar isu-isu tempatan yang tidak diselesaikan. Dan saya rasa kalau kita berjaya untuk membuat demikian, ataupun rakyat berjaya untuk menggerakkan secara organik, sebagai contoh macam bendera putih lah, walaupun ada yang melihat itu sebagai satu simbol menyerah, tapi saya lebih lihat itu sebagai simbol perlawanan, bahawa rakyat ingin terus hidup dan terus ingin berjuang.
Thank you so much, Sardar Ashraf. The white flag is not a symbol of giving up, but a symbol of continuing the fight. I really liked that. Before we take questions from the Facebook Live audience, I'd like to invite our panelists to say a few words in closing to encourage Malaysian voters to not give up hope and to continue to exercise their right to vote, because silence from voters is the true death of democracy. YB Michelle, would you like to share a few words?
Yeah. There's a quote that I always go back to, and it is from a book that I was given as a young lawyer, and it is from Alan Dershowitz, where he says that aspirations don't disappoint, so long as you realize that the struggle for liberty, justice, and anything else worth pursuing never stays won. And that is the reality then, as it is the reality now. I think it would be a mistake for each and every one of us to think that there is an end to this journey. It is a process, it is always evolving. And when we realize that, I think our tenacity and our resilience would start developing, and it will start building up. And that will also in a way manage our expectations, because like what YB Saddiq said, we are, sorry, I think it was Tama, you said that we were quite a young democracy. And if we look to other older democracies, they have gone through a lot to get them to where they are today. So I would say take heart in that. I would say that Malaysia has a long way to go, and we need to all keep in the race in order to meet, I wouldn't say the finish line, but in order to continue this journey. It requires each and every one of us to change our perspective of things. I like to say this to young people. You know, when I was overseas there, and I think many of you who are overseas will probably face the same thing as well, where our elders, out of good intention, would advise that we would have better prospects if we stayed where we were, whether it was in the US or the UK or Australia, because life is just that much easier. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that, you know, although they came from a position saying that opportunity is not available in Malaysia, I do think it's really a matter of perspective, because yes, you might not have the same opportunity, job opportunities, for example, that you would get in the UK being a financial hub, or similarly in Singapore, you would have, you know, the big fours and big law firms who are all based there, and none of them are in Malaysia. So yes, exposure and all is different, but I do think that in Malaysia, you have opportunities to build ladders for other people to climb. It does require a group of people who have that tenacity and have that resilience and have that heart, and also probably know that the change that they seek to build might not materialize in their lifetime, but it is worth putting the building blocks in place, because it is not for the now, it is also for the future, and that is also worth fighting for.
Thank you, YB Michelle. Opportunities to build ladders for other Malaysians to climb. Kira, what should young voters remember in this fight to recoup the power of the people?
I think, I mean, try not to repeat what, YB Michelle has said, but I think what young people should remember and consider is to have empathy and to have kindness. I think despite, yes, we are all very angry with our democracy being violated in this manner, but we also can't forget that we are living through one of, the worst pandemic in my very short lifetime, the worst pandemic any of us have known and possibly will ever know. And I just feel like, we need to, when we want to, we make a decision to leave or to stay, I think the decision will come down to, am I doing this for myself, or am I doing this for the people around me? Am I doing this for my community, my people? I think when young people have empathy, they'll have a stronger sense of ownership towards their community and to a further extent, their country. And you don't feel like, and also I think, eventually it helps you build, it helps you build towards being a better leader. So I think that when the question of like, is this worth it, or is there even a point anymore? I think you need to take a look around and seeing how much people are suffering, and remind ourselves that we have to stay true and we have to fight, because if we don't, then no one else will. Our democracy is ours to shape it. Our Malaysian politics is ours to shape it. We need more and more good people in politics, and giving up and turning away and walking away is not the solution to have better politics in Malaysia.
Thank you so much, Kira. Tharma, what would you like to share with Malaysian voters?
I think the most important thing is to rethink how we approach politics, right? Because as I said earlier, right, we've sort of normalized this sort of culture where we adore our leaders, right, and we immensely trust them, and we say, okay, you know what, these are our leaders, we must respect them, and there is also part of it. There's this feudal culture mindset where your leaders, your political leaders, are also supposed to be your community leaders, and you're not supposed to disrespect them and stuff like that. So I think the important thing is to change that political norm and to reevaluate it. But I think the second and most important part is that to regard ourselves as active citizens, right? So active citizens means that you don't necessarily have to be a politician, you don't have to be an activist, you don't have to be an NGO person, right? Or you don't have to be a paid cyber trooper to care about politics, right? Or to fight for politics, right? Or to be engaged in the conversation of politics. The fundamental idea is that all of us have a stake in this, right? All of us are affected by this, right? Even if you're a business person, right? And you want to have government contracts and you face corruption on the way, you can't get certain tenders. Every element or every aspect of your life, there is some level of politics. So you have a direct stake because it impacts you. So the question is that if it impacts you, shouldn't you, speak up about it? Shouldn't you try to push for certain change? Shouldn't you have the conversations and push for these things to happen? Because I think, drawing on the experience of, let's say, Kira and myself, right? When we advocated for Undi 18, we were not doing this full time, right? I was a full-time engineer. Kira was working in a education NGO, Teach for Malaysia. So each of us had full-time jobs. Yet we realized that during weekends, after work, right, these were things that we can contribute to, and we can sort of shape the conversation and push this particular advocacy that we believed in. So if we can do it, I don't think that it's impossible for many more people out there, right? Especially those who are in the middle class, those who are in the upper middle class, those who are in the T20 range, right? Those who do not necessarily have a lot of financial constraints, right? There really isn't much of a reason why you cannot sort of be more engaged in the process of democracy, thinking about it, talking about it, and also being more active in pushing for greater policy changes. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Tharma. Ashraf, how can we continue to empower voters? What are your thoughts?
Ya, saya rasa memanglah paling penting adalah pendidikan pengundi. Tapi maksudnya dengan pendidikan pengundi itu bukanlah sekadar pendidikan sivil, tapi pendidikan secara keseluruhan itu amat penting. Maksudnya pengundi perlu ataupun anak-anak muda dan perlu dididik dengan dari sudut sejarahnya, dari sudut hak sivilnya, supaya lebih tercerah dan dapat membuat pertimbangan yang lebih baik, dan itu memerlukan satu saya rasa mungkin reformasi pendidikan yang lebih besar. Tapi untuk mendidik pengundi, saya rasa pertamanya mungkin pengundi perlu sedar ataupun semua kita perlu sedar bahawa demokrasi macam Tarma cakap tadi adalah satu proses. Dia bukanlah benda yang terus perfect ataupun terus sempurna. Terus cantik sudah kan. Dia tidak begitu, dia adalah satu proses. Dan proses itu kadang-kadang memanglah demokrasi proses yang bising, kita akan lihat banyak percanggahan pendapat ataupun perbezaan pendapat, perbezaan pandangan tentang bagaimana negara ini dapat ke depan. Tapi apapun, saya fikir kita perlu ada proses itu, dan sebab ialah bila kita sebut tentang politik ini, kadang-kadang dia tidak dapat lari dari kepentingan sendiri kan, walaupun walaupun wakil rakyat ada sebutkan tentang ialah hak rakyat, kuasa rakyat dan sebagainya, tapi kemungkinan untuk ada kepentingan peribadi, kepentingan kelompok sendiri itu ada. Dan di sini saya rasa pengundi ataupun rakyat perlu sedar bahawa kita perlu lebih push kepada program-program apa yang nak disampaikan oleh wakil rakyat ataupun parti-parti politik ini untuk mewarnakan udara demokrasi di negara kita. Dan program-program tersebut perlu dijelaskan dengan baik, dan kita pun rakyat pun perlu tahu bahawa apa program yang hendak rakyat sendiri kedepankan kepada wakil-wakil rakyat lah, supaya mereka dapat membuat supaya mereka dapat melaksanakan tanggungjawab mereka sebagai wakil rakyat itu dengan lebih baik, dan tidak mengurangkan politicking sikit lah kan, terutamanya dalam tempoh sekarang yang kita ada sekarang, dan mungkin lebih 2 tahun sebelum ke PRU ke depan kalau tidak ada snap election lah. Saya rasa inilah tempoh terbaik untuk wakil-wakil rakyat di Parlimen ataupun di DUN untuk push for reform kan, sebab kedudukan kerusi di Dewan tak banyak beza. Jadi di sinilah peluang untuk sesama wakil rakyat untuk berbincang apakah reformasi-reformasi yang perlu agar negara kita tak berulang lagi seperti yang kita lihat dalam setahun inilah, dengan ketidaktentuan yang sangat pening lah pening. Kita pun yang bergerak, yang ambil tahu tentang isu ni pun pening. Saya rasa rakyat di bawah yang melihat itu sekadar bising-bising je pun saya rasa lebih tentu penat. So inilah peluang wakil rakyat untuk perbaiki dalam masa tempoh yang sekejap ini untuk melaksanakan betul-betul reformasi, tak kisahlah daripada pihak manapun, berbincang semula, duduk kurangkan politiki dan betul-betul fikir untuk rakyat yang ke depan.
Thank you, Saudara Ashraf. We're going to look at some questions from our Facebook Live audience. The first question is directed to YB Michelle. We're all putting up the black flag, and Ismail Sabri just announced that some states are going on to phase 2. I feel like other MPs are powerless, and now the people are trying to show their anger but still get probed by PDRM. So what is the best next step right now?
Right. This is where I would say people need to make their voices heard, as cliche as it sounds, and don't underestimate what you can actually do and the influence that you have just from the conversations that you would be having, because much of the young people that you see out there in the forefront now is a product of those conversations, a product of people engaging with them and telling them that, hey, you know, this is what is going on out there, and we do need to make a stand. Now, where there is injustice, especially, I think all the more reason your voice needs to be louder. And it is because of that that we do hear of cases where people who put up the white flag or black flag, whatever it is, are being probed by the police, ostensibly because it is an act of protest against the government. So if it wasn't for that person saying that or coming out to tell that story, I don't think any one of us would have known about it. So make your voice heard. I would say engage with your member of parliament and your state assemblyman and your local councillors. They play a very important part in democracy, and you need to make sure that they are accountable as well. Where you do see that they are doing good work, come around and support them, because how this forum opened up in telling the story of a member of parliament and ADUN in Perak who decided to jump ship because of allocation reasons. The struggle is real. When you don't have enough money to run your office, it does become a strain on you. When you are with whatever salary that you have, if more than half of it goes to just running your office and paying rent, electricity bills, salary for staff, and you have your commitments at home as well, more so if you have a family, the struggle is real. So if you do find it in you, and if you see that your MP, your ADUN, your councillors are doing good work, I would encourage you to support them as well. Write into them. Don't underestimate that. I, for one, I reply all my emails by myself. I make an effort to do that. I don't farm it out to any of my PAs. And the reason why I do that is because I want to make sure that I have a good pulse of what is happening on the ground, so that I know the problems that they are going through, and I'll be able to find solutions and strategies in order to overcome whatever might be the systemic hindrance to them obtaining what they should, or to them obtaining help. So if you go through that process and you realize that your member of parliament and your ADUN is not as responsive as you would like, or they are not performing their responsibility, that is part and parcel of democracy as well, all right? And you need to know that, and you won't be able to know that unless you engage in that process. So do that, write letters, write emails, engage with them. All the more reason that your voice needs to be heard now.
Thank you so much, YB Michelle. The second question from Facebook Live is directed to Undi 18. The question is that there's too much power and it's too centralized to a limited number of people. The power should be distributed from federal/state to the locals. This includes the enforcement agencies. So what is the meaningful remedy when the powerful persecute the weak? Tharma, would you like to take it, or Kira?
Sure. I can go for this. Okay, I think the first part is one part of this remedy, right, in terms of renegotiating this decentralization of power is something like local council elections, right? I think that's something that we should definitely have, because essentially it renegotiates what is the roles and responsibilities. Because what we have over time is basically this creeping centralization where federal government takes over certain powers from state governments, and in tune or in line with that, state government has to sort of subsume power of what was previously local councils. So when we have local council elections and then we allow or we give authority and autonomy for local councillors that are elected by those people on the ground, you essentially localize power, right? And then you pull back certain responsibilities and roles from state governments, and then there is a further renegotiation by the state government with the federal government. So I think that's one element that matters. But answering, I think, the crux of the question, right, in terms of what exactly can you do when the powerful persecutes the weak? Honestly, the real answer is, to be brave and make sure that you stand together, right? The powerful can only persecute the weak because the weak are fractured, right? We are separated, we are divided, and we are not united in terms of standing together against the powerful and the evil, right? So therefore, I think it is important to, and this also sort of answers a little bit about the previous question, right? What can we do when these sort of situations happen? I do think that one part is also trying to protest more, trying to go to the streets more, trying to show that people care and people are angry and we are willing to be loud about it and we are willing to challenge the government. I think that part is so important to show that strength. But second is that to have that continuous awareness and to be active in pushing back against the narrative and defending the weak. I think that's also a very important part in shifting that power structure and not allowing all that power to be with the strong.
Thank you very much, Tharma. Ashraf, do you have anything to add to that?
Ya, sikit saya tambah. Boleh bercakap kurang 1 minit. Ya, satunya mungkin ada kuasa yang terlampau berpusat di persekutuan. Tapi kita juga kena ingat bahawa kuasa yang berpusat di persekutuan itu sebenarnya berpusat juga kepada Perdana Menteri. Perdana Menteri kan terlampau banyak kuasa di tangan beliau. Sebagai contoh, ada persoalan itu tentang agensi yang kadang-kadang dilihat macam powerless untuk execute, untuk prosecute ataupun untuk siasat. Disebabkan kebanyakan agensi-agensi ini dilantik oleh Perdana Menteri lah kan. Contohnya perhatikan SPRM, IGP, walaupun kehakiman dan sebagainya itu walaupun memang ada mekanisme untuk melantik, tapi kuasanya besar kepada Perdana Menteri dan juga menteri-menteri lah. Jadi saya rasa benda itu pun perlu dikurangkan agar perhatikan terutamanya macam SPRM, SPR, polis itu betul-betul benar-benar bebas. Dan juga parlimen pun sebenarnya di bawah kuasa dari segi staffing dan sebagainya pun masih juga dipegang oleh eksekutif lah. So too much power in kita punya eksekutif ni sekarang. Jadi perkara itu perlu dikurangkan dan perlu dikurangkan segera lah.
Terima kasih, Ashraf. I'd like to pass on YB Saddiq's apologies as YB had to leave due to a family emergency. I'd like to thank all panelists today for your valuable sharing and for sharing your time with us. Bersih 2.0 is currently running the simulated recall election campaign, allowing you, the Malaysian voter, to decide whether you'd like to sack or keep elected representatives who party hop. For more information, go to recall.bersih.org or visit Bersih 2.0's official Facebook page. We hope you're encouraged by our panelists sharing tonight.